Welcome back to another deep dive. Today, we're going deep into Bitcoin.
Sounds good.
But we're not just talking about the basics. We're diving into a specific feature, time locks.
Ah, time locks, yes. It's like something out of a sci-fi movie.
Exactly. But this isn't sci-fi. This is real, and it's happening right now. And to help us understand, we have this transcript from a Bitcoin Israel video. They break it all down.
It's pretty mind-blowing stuff, honestly,
Mhm.
especially when you start to think about the implications. Like, have you ever thought about how you might pass on your Bitcoin to your loved ones?
It's not something you think about every day.
Right. But with time locks, you can actually program that inheritance right into the Bitcoin protocol.
Okay, now, before we go full back to the future, let's
Yeah.
make sure everyone's caught up.
Sure.
So, a Bitcoin transaction, what's it actually made of?
Good place to start.
Right. I mean, we always hear about these mysterious transactions, but what's in them?
Okay, so think of each transaction like a set of instructions.
Okay, I like that. Instruction.
Yeah, you have these inputs,
Uh-huh.
which are basically like saying, hey, I'm using these specific Bitcoins from over here.
Right, like sourcing them from your wallet or wherever.
Exactly. And these inputs, they're technically called UTXOs, unspent transaction outputs, but inputs is way easier.
Way easier. So, we've got our inputs, these instructions saying where the Bitcoin is coming from. What about where it's going?
That's where the outputs come in. They basically tell everyone, all right, these Bitcoins are going this address now.
So, inputs are like the from, and outputs are like the to in our instructions.
Exactly. It's
What?
like sending a package. You've got the sender's address, the recipient's address.
And you can't forget the rules, right? The scripts.
Oh, absolutely. The scripts are like the rules of the game. They decide how those Bitcoins can be unlocked and spent.
So like a secret code or something.
Kind of.
Yeah.
They ensure that only the rightful owner can move those Bitcoins around.
That makes sense. But it also makes you wonder,
What's that?
well, if each transaction is like a set of instructions, are there things those instructions don't say?
You're on the right track. Bitcoin transactions are surprisingly private. They don't reveal your total balance, your wallet details, or even information about change outputs. It's all very discreet.
That's pretty cool, actually. It's like it gives you privacy even though it's all on this public ledger.
Exactly. And this focus on specific instructions, this idea of directing where those Bitcoins go next, that's key to understanding time locks.
Speaking of time locks, that's where things get really interesting. This whole idea of setting a future date for a transaction, it sounds almost dot magical.
It does, doesn't it? That's N-lock time for you. It's like a built-in time delay for your Bitcoin. You can say, I want this transaction to go through, but not until this specific date and time.
So imagine this. You want to leave some Bitcoin to, let's say, your kids, but you don't want to share your private keys with them just yet.
Smart move. It's a big concern for a lot of people. You don't want to give up control entirely.
Exactly. So instead of handing over the keys to the kingdom, you could use unlock time. You set it to, say, 2030. If something happens to you before then, boom, the transaction goes through and they inherit your Bitcoin.
No need to worry about complicated wills or lawyers. It's all built right into the Bitcoin protocol.
That is shockingly simple and brilliant at the same time. It's elegant, isn't it? You get peace of mind knowing your Bitcoin will go where you want it to, even if, well, you know.
Right. But what if you change your mind before 2030?
Yeah.
What if you want to, I don't know, buy a new car or something?
That's where Bitcoin's double spend prevention comes in. You can't spend the same Bitcoin twice. So if you move those funds before 2030, that original time lock transaction, gone.
It's like hitting the cancel button on that future transaction.
Precisely. You retain complete control. And here's the really cool part. This concept of putting a time delay on your transactions, it's not just about others inheriting your Bitcoin. You can use it on yourself, too. Wait, you're saying I can lock myself out of my own funds? Now, that's an interesting concept, and one that I think we need to unpack further. So we were talking about locking yourself out of your own Bitcoin. It seems a little counterintuitive, right? Like, why would you want to do that?
Well, think of it like this. Let's say, you're saving up for something big.
Okay, like a house or a new car.
Exactly. And you know yourself, you might be tempted to dip into those savings every now and then.
I think we've all been there.
Right. So you use a time lock to basically tell yourself, nope, this Bitcoin is off limits until this specific date. It's like a forced savings plan enforced by the blockchain.
So it's like a commitment device almost.
Exactly. You're making a promise to your future self. And the cool thing is, with Bitcoin, you can actually do this. You can set these rules in place.
That's wild. So we've
Yeah.
got these unlock time transactions, which are like setting a future date on your Bitcoin. But then there's this other layer, these relative time locks. That's where the sequence field comes in, right?
Yeah, you got it. Sequence is a bit of a misnomer because it can actually do a lot more than just sequence things. It can set time delays that are relative to other transactions.
Okay, now we're getting into the really complex stuff. Can you give me an example of how that would even work?
Sure. Imagine you and a friend, right? You've both put some Bitcoin into a shared account, maybe for a project or an investment.
Okay, I'm following so far.
Now, you want to make sure that neither of you can run off with all the Bitcoin, right? So you use relative time locks to create a system where you both have to agree before any funds can be moved.
So it's like a safety net, ensuring that no one can just empty the account without the other person knowing.
Exactly. You're basically linking transactions together in a chain. So the first transaction might be, we both agree to lock up these funds for a month. Then after a month, another transaction kicks in that says, okay, now we can split the funds 50-50.
But what if one person tries to cheat? What if they try to broadcast that first transaction early and grab all the Bitcoin?
That's the genius of it,
Yeah.
because the transactions are linked. If one person tries to cheat, the other person has a pre-signed transaction ready to go that will automatically claim their share of the funds.
Oh, wow. So it's like a built-in deterrent against bad behavior.
Precisely. It incentivizes everyone to play by the rules because they know that any attempt to cheat will be immediately countered.
It's like a financial Mexican standoff.
Exactly. And you can imagine how useful this could be for all sorts of things, right? Escrow services, multi-signature wallets, even complex smart contracts.
It's amazing how much complexity you can build into these transactions.
And it all comes back to this idea of time locks, of controlling when a transaction can happen, not just if it can happen.
Now let's bring it back to inheritance. We talked about unlocked time for setting a future date, but how do these relative time locks factor in?
Well, remember how we talked about the potential issue with unlock time? What if you set it for 2030, but then for whatever reason you're still alive and kicking in 2030?
Right, your kids could be stuff waiting.
Exactly. So to make inheritance even more secure and flexible, you can use a combination of relative time locks and what are called alert and recovery transactions.
Okay, this is where I need you to break it down for me, step by step. What are these alert and recovery transactions, and how do they work?
Okay, so we left off talking about these alert and recovery transactions. It sounds kind of mysterious.
A little bit, yeah. But it's actually a really clever way to make inheritance with time locks even more secure.
All right, walk me through it. How does it work?
So instead of just having that single transaction set for, say, 2030, we set up two.
Two transactions, yeah.
The first one, the alert transaction, is like sending a signal. It basically moves the Bitcoin back to yourself.
Wait, so nothing actually changes hands?
Not really, no. It's more like, think of it like raising a flag on the blockchain. It's a way to prove that you're still alive and kicking.
I see. It creates a record. So if
Like
someone
that.
sees an alert transaction from this address after 2030, exactly, they know the original plan is probably still in effect.
Yeah.
But here's the key. The recovery transaction, the one that actually sends the Bitcoin to your heir, that one's also time locked.
Okay, so we've got two locks on this thing now.
Yep. But the second lock, the one on the recovery transaction, is set relative to the first one. Let's say the alert transaction goes through in 2030. The recovery transaction might be set to activate a week later.
So if you don't cancel that recovery transaction during that week.
Then it goes through, and your heir gets the Bitcoin. It adds this extra layer of, are you sure?
It's like a failsafe. That's actually really clever.
It also highlights something really important about this whole time lock thing. We're still in the early days, and there are things to watch out for.
Oh, for sure. Like,
Well, remember how we talked about transaction fees? If that initial alert transaction has a really low fee, it might get stuck.
so even though it's programmed to go through, it might not actually happen if the network is congested.
Exactly. There are ways around that, of course. Transaction accelerators, where you can pay extra to get your transaction prioritized.
Right, but those can get pricey.
They can. There's also this thing called CPFP, or child pays for parent, where the inheritor could actually boost the fee on that original transaction to get it moving.
So even if you mess up the fee, there might be a way to salvage it.
Potentially, yeah.
Yeah.
But it all comes back to this. You need to be aware of how these things work before you need them. Setting up alerts, monitoring the blockchain. It's not something you can just set and forget.
Got it. So time locks. Incredibly powerful, tons of potential, but not exactly set it and forget it technology yet.
Exactly. Now, we've talked a lot about individuals using time locks, but this technology is also being used by businesses right now.
Oh, yeah. Give me an example.
So there's this company, Liana, and they built a Bitcoin wallet. specifically designed for businesses. And guess what? They use time locks.
That makes sense. I mean, businesses, especially ones dealing with a lot of Bitcoin, they need that extra security.
Absolutely. And one of the things Liana does is they use time locks for their recovery keys. So let's say you're a company and you lose your main Bitcoin key.
Oh, that's every crypto holder's nightmare.
Right. But with Liana, you've got a backup key. But instead of that backup key giving you instant access, which could be risky if it fell into the wrong hands.
Someone could drain the company's accounts?
Exactly. So Liana uses a time lock. Even with the backup key, you have to wait a certain amount of time before you can access the funds.
That's actually really smart. It gives you a chance to catch any mistakes or nefarious activity. But earlier you mentioned that while this Liana approach might work well for businesses, it might not be as ironclad as, say, the two-transaction method for inheritance.
That's a really good point. It all comes down to priorities, right? For a business, they might need to be able to access those funds a little quicker, even with a time delay. But for inheritance, where you want that extra layer of certainty, that two-transaction setup with the alert and recovery, that's probably still the gold standard.
So different tools for different jobs. Got it. Man, it's amazing how much depth there is to this time lock thing. We've covered inheritance, saving, business security, even preventing theft.
Yeah.
What else can you do with these things?
That's the exciting part. We're only just scratching the surface. As more people learn about time locks and start experimenting, who knows what kind of creative uses they'll come up with. The potential is practically limitless. But honestly, what blows my mind is that this stuff isn't more common. Like, why don't more wallets have these features built in?
Right? It seems like such a no-brainer.
I know. I think part of it is, well, it's still technically complex. Setting up these transactions usually requires using command line tools, understanding the code. It's not exactly user-friendly.
It sounds like we need a time lock app that's as easy to use as, like, setting an alarm on your phone.
Right. Imagine that. If time locks were that simple, everyone could be using them. It would truly revolutionize how we think about Bitcoin and value transfer.
It's like we're on the cusp of something huge, but we need that final push to make it accessible to everyone.
Well, on that note of future possibilities, I think we've reached the end of our time lock deep dive.
Time flies when you're exploring the future of finance.
It really does. A huge thank you to our expert for guiding us through this complex but incredibly fascinating topic.
My pleasure. It's always exciting to talk about the cutting edge of Bitcoin.
And to our listeners, we hope you've enjoyed this deep dive into the world of Bitcoin time locks. It's a topic that might seem daunting at first, but as we've learned, it's also full of potential. Until next time, keep exploring the ever-evolving world of crypto.